All right, yeah, so just a couple quick things. So big thanks to Insightful for offering to host it. Also thanks to MCN for, along with Insightful, providing the food and beverages and my time, which hopefully will be helpful. So for those of you that weren't around the Ruby group when I was announcing this idea, the impetus for this kind of grew out of, there's a big gap between like I've just finished the Rails tutorial and getting to be I'm a person who writes Ruby every day as part of my job. And we're kind of trying to address that need. One of my big beliefs is that you really learn by doing. Like you get so much more out of watching people write code, even if it's just something that seems rather mundane, like just watching someone else's process and kind of working through the problems yourself. So my goal is to have some forum for doing that. I do want this to be a really interactive thing. Unfortunately, there's a lot more people here than I expected when I announced this, so that might be a little hard to do. But just in general, stop me at any point in time if you have questions. I'd be glad to take them. And I have some idea of where I want to take this, but if it goes in another direction, I'm fine with that. Okay. Yeah, so this is a discussion, not a presentation. So stop me at any point in time. And I should mention just in general, assuming there is interest, I'd be glad to do more of these things and would be glad to have suggestions on format. If we could have smaller groups where people can have their own workstations and look at code, great. So this is your group. Help me make it what would help you. So that said, any questions before we actually dig into some code stuff? Cool. Super interactive. I like it.
Can everybody see a screen well enough? Maybe. James, maybe font size up a little bit.
That's not useful anymore. Cool. We're not going to be looking at the GitHub thing too much. I guess so. The topic for today is background jobs. I kind of picked this because there is a lot of different directions we can cover here. There's a lot to it. But I was loosely thinking of kind of giving you guys some overview of kind of what the lay of the land is, and then we can look at some actual code. Just a straw poll here. So what people's backgrounds? Who is pretty much just a rank newbie, has no clue what they're doing here? Awesome. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Yeah, seriously. Who has heard of background jobs, is kind of interested in them, but has never actually worked with them before? Cool. Decent chunk. Good. This is mostly for you, I think.
Background jobs. I don't know if that counts. Like actual Linux background jobs.
It'll help a little bit. I'm trying not to get too technical, but it doesn't hurt. And who's already got Sidekick in production and is just here to support me? Awesome. I love you guys too. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, cool. So I did post a blog thing. If you guys need to review any of that at any point in time, check it out. I sent a link out. But basically, the concept with the background. So I'm going to talk about most of this in the framework of a Rails application. That I think is what a lot of people are using. It goes for other things, but this is kind of the main use case. You guys have a basic idea of how a Rails application works, right? The user sends in a request, your server does some stuff, and then sends back a response consisting of some HTML. I think when you write your early applications, that's it. After they send back the response, they sit there and wait until someone asks for another page. The idea behind background work is there's a lot that goes on that a user shouldn't need to wait for. And so background jobs are all about managing that. So lots of examples. I think probably the prototypical one, like the first one that people run into, is sending an email. Like your user signs up for your site. Sending an email can be fraught with peril. The service you're connecting to might be down or slow. You really don't want the user having clicked the sign up button. You want to send them their page back saying, hey, we got it, and then worry about sending the confirmation later. Hopefully soon thereafter, but not before sending the page back. But there's tons of other examples. Really anything that hits a remote service is a good candidate for being a background job because, again, you don't want your users to see errors or timeouts if the service that you're connecting to errors or times out. Yeah, just grab a seat wherever. Sorry. So I've used them for all sorts of stuff, indexing documents into Elasticsearch, throwing nodes into Neo4j, even doing just, database cleanup, deletes, things that would be slow. The Resque folks go whole hog, and just anything that's not fast is a background job. So there's lots to do there. So there are, again, as many different background job tools out there as there are reasons to do them. The ones that I kind of want to mention are the ones that I'm familiar with. They just happen to be the ones that I'm familiar with, but I think that roughly correlates to popularity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Resque, Delayed Job, Sidekick, and Sucker Punch. So kind of the main dimensions to think through those, kind of the big first thing to understand is how is the work actually being done, which gets a little bit into processes versus threads, which I'm not going to cover much in detail. The high-level thing you need to know is a process is a really lightweight thing. If you have lots of processes working, they are probably sharing memory. That may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing. It means you're not using as much memory, but at the same time, you have kind of coordination issues where one worker can step on another worker's toes and cause all sorts of headaches. So it's kind of up to you to manage that. Processes are heavier weight things, but because of that, they are sort of sandboxed and isolated, which can be good or bad depending on your exact use case. For those four that I'm talking about, so your server process is its own process. Most of them have a philosophy of you spin up a worker process to work through whatever work you have to do. And then it kind of differs as to how that actually works. Delayed Job and Resque will each have a process for each worker that you have active. Sidekick has a thread, so again, lighter weight, but then you have to worry about things being safe for threads. If that doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. Not a hugely important point, but that is one important dimension. Yeah, not covering that one, but yes, true. The other gem that I have looked at a lot is Sucker Punch. Sucker Punch is, again, a threaded solution, but it runs threads inside your actual Rails server, which is really brittle. But the nice thing about that is you can run it on Heroku for free. So who's familiar with Heroku, deploys on Heroku, sort of thing? So yeah, essentially, if you want to run some background jobs but don't want to pay for it, Sucker Punch, the way to go, absolutely. If not, you probably want a more robust solution. Other dimensions to differentiate them. So again, you'll have you have your server process, you have your workers in whatever shape they're in. You have this question of, so your user sends in a request, you need to register that there is some work to be done so that the workers can go take off on it. And there's a question of, well, how do you manage communicating to your workers what needs to happen? Here we have Delayed Job, which actually adds a record to your database like you normally would. It's just a simple active record thing. So that makes it kind of easier to set up and get running. But that means that you'll run into some scaling issues there. As soon as you have something accessing it often, or you have a long queue, you have long wait times to get work done. Which is why a lot of people move towards Resque or Sidekick. They use Redis to coordinate things, which is a lighter in-memory data store. Other differentiation points, you can look at built-in features. Resque and Sidekick come with nice administration consoles. Delayed Job doesn't, but there's a gem for it. Sidekick and Delayed Job will retry jobs that fail. Resque doesn't, but there's a gem for that. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you can kind of configure whatever solution you want, usually just by dropping in some gems. So that is a really whirlwind, high-level overview of what background work is. I don't know how enlightening that is, but let's lay of the land. So my goal for this session is I've got a simple, silly little app here that I will now demo. Anybody pulled this down already? Have it running? Okay, so it's super Web 3.0. Oh, sorry. Yep, that's good. Live coding. So first off, just tooling, since that I think is a useful part of the conversation here. I am running tmux to have these multiple terminals open. I'm hoping everyone's familiar with Rails. Has anyone not done any sort of Rails thing at all? A few people. Okay, so Rails is a web server. All I'm doing here is I'm booting Rails. The B is a shortcut for bundle exec. If you're familiar with bundle, cool. If not, don't worry about that. Not important. I am, because it's cool. Oh, weird. Okay, so I'm just going to navigate to that page. So here the server is running. Now let's request a cat. Apparently that's really hard work. It's taking a long time. I really don't want to sit here and wait for it. Oh, but here we go. We got a cat. Cool. All right. So the goal for today is going to be, let's take this, let's examine how it works, let's get that work done in the background so that we don't have to wait on it. And we'll mention some other stuff along the way. So any questions about where we're headed? Cool. All the code's on GitHub. Feel free to follow along, check back later, ask me questions, whatever. So I guess maybe we should start by looking at how the thing actually works. If you haven't seen Rails before, I'll just do a quick tour. So this is the routes file. The root page, which is what we looked at, is served by the cats index controller. So let's take a look at that. Here is the cats controller. It doesn't do a whole lot. The index action does nothing, which by Rails convention means it's going to serve the index page. And we have a serve action that I'll get back to. Let's take a look at the index page. OK, so here's some actual interesting business logic. The bit that you care about is button to serve cats path method post. So that is generating this button. When I click on that, it posts to the serve action right over here. And so what that does is it grabs the current user. That's a device thing. I'm not going to worry too much about that, but assume we have a user, like we have some notion of I am logged in. And it's going to cat me and then send me back where I came from. So that's a user. Let's check out the user. Notice the user has many cat requests. When they ask for a cat, we save that in the database as saying, hey, I want to see a cat. And that's all the cat me method really is. We're going to save a request in the database and then tell the request to fulfill itself. Here is the cat request model. That's what I'm looking at now. So that's a method defined on the cat request. And so notice a cat request, if you're familiar with join sort of stuff, cat request is a join table between users and cats, essentially. So all the fulfill is doing is it's just going to sit there and wait for 5 seconds because I had to mock up something that looked time consuming. So we'll pretend that's a difficult thing. It's going to update itself by setting the cat to just a random choice of a cat. I've got some cats stored in the database. That bit's not terribly interesting. And then all it's doing is just calling out the backticks, shells out a command. So it's just as if you typed in open the path to the cat picture and told it to open in Google Chrome. So that's what it's doing. Again, I realize if you haven't looked at Rails before, this is going to be kind of foreign to you, but does that, in broad strokes, make sense? Yeah, question?
Okay, what is this cat thing doing? Is it doing something while something else is happening in the background?
Right, yeah. When I click that button, I'm essentially getting down to this. I'm creating a cat request and just following through this. So this is just waiting for 5 seconds. I've already got, maybe that's worth showing. So this is a Rails console. I've already got a whole bunch of cats stored in the database. So there's a whole bunch of cat objects, and they all have paths associated with them. I've already stored all the pictures on my local machine. That's not terribly interesting, so I'm not going to belabor how I got those. It's in the source code if you want to look at it. But at the end of the day, these are pointing to files that are on this computer. And after doing some work and doing some waiting, clicking the button ends up as if you had opened up a console and typed in open and then the path to this file that I've saved. And open is an OSX command that just opens it up in this case, Google Chrome, because I said Google Chrome here.
Okay, so is it going to show you cat pictures until something loads?
No.
I guess I'm missing.
Right. So this is a toy app. This is not useful. Unless you're, yeah. at the end of the day, like I said, kind of one of the main use cases for background jobs is when you're communicating with an external service. I want to talk a little bit about testing, and it gets a whole lot more complicated when you're trying to coordinate with something. And in fact, I got all these from EdgeCats, which happened to be down this afternoon, so I was really glad that I had them saved locally, because otherwise none of this would have worked. So just for simplicity's sake, I have things on my computer. It's just for the sake of having a toy example. So that.
This is the point. Like clicking the button gets you to the gym.
Yeah.
So it just
Gets you to the gym.
To-
this.
yeah,
Like this is
that image.
This is what's supposed to happen.
Picks a random image, opens it up in Chrome. That's it.
Images.
yeah. But in real life, it might if it were like a real app, the work
a
of getting
real
the cat picture might. If it was something that was more than cat pictures, it might take longer than instantaneously to find the picture on your computer. You might have to send a request to, like your
Right.
catpictures.com,
Yeah,
ask
maybe-
for another one, and it could take 2 seconds to respond to you, or it might say, "Oh, error! You've asked for too many
I'll
cat
get 2
pictures in
seconds.
the last hour."
Yeah, I mean, a real common thing is, there are tons of apps that interact with Twitter. So, your user may do something that requires your service communicating with Twitter, and Twitter just might be down. So, I mean, you need to manage the fact that it could take them, 2 minutes to get back to you, or it may never come. That's one of the main points for background jobs. Yeah.
Just to oversimplify, you're just trying to get rid of that spinner.
Yeah, essentially. What I really like cat GIFs, and I don't want to have to sit here and wait 5 seconds for one. I want to be able to mash that button like a million times, and then just open them when they can.
Just trying to overcome.
Yeah, so that's the end game. Okay, so in this README here, I have kind of outlined the steps that I intend to go through. So from this project, the goal is going to be, let's pick a backend that we care about to do all of this queuing and background job stuff.
Actually, this makes sense, and it's just this log box process, and it can be any source. So that's really cool.
Yeah, so it's really anything that you're going to want to do because a user requests something that you're not going to want to wait on before getting back to the user. I mean, when I click that button, I don't care how long it takes you to go fetch a cat GIF. I want you to say, okay, one's coming, and then handle it whenever you can. So any sort of thing that's going to take a long time, let's just handle it in the background and not make our users wait. There's no reason to delay that response. Yeah.
So I'm going to take a wild stab and say that we're going to fetch a cat when the page loads before the user clicks. So it's pre-fetched when he clicks it.
Nope. No. I mean, that certainly is another approach to sort of the performance angle. But no, so the goal for this is just going to be, like, you click the button, it's still going to take 5 seconds because it still waits for 5 seconds before doing anything. I'm obviously, the first optimization is take out the sleep 5. But assuming we're not doing that, but it takes however long it takes. But I want to get the page back, so it doesn't. I mean, when I click there, it's sitting here spinning. I can't do anything. I can't re-click. None of that's useful to me. I want another page, and I want to be able to click again.
Can I give a concrete example where I've done this exact pattern?
Sure.
in a real
Yeah,
app?
please do.
We had to verify that they had a valid PayPal account, but we didn't want to wait. So it's like they enter the information. 90% of the time or more, they will have a valid PayPal account, but it takes us a little while to find that out. So what we did was they immediately get back to a page that says that it's verifying, and then we set the background job, and only if it came back as false did we have to set something that later said, wait a second, you have to go correct this because it wasn't a valid PayPal account. We didn't make them wait for that.
Yeah. Sorry. And again, the one I use all the time in like every app I've ever put up on the web is, a user signs up and they get a confirmation email. Like, that can take a long time to send. You want to send them back the page that says, hey, you're registered, you'll get an email in 5 to 10 minutes or something. You don't want to make them sit there and wait 5 to 10 minutes and say, all right, we actually sent the email, now here's your page. Any sort of thing like that.
Plus, you're blocking your web server. Plus, you're blocking your Rails web server.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the whole thing gets bogged down if you're...
I can't help anybody else while it's doing that.
Right.
And on the email example, you can go beyond that. That's a perfect use case for this.
Yeah, that's the core of it. Okay, so again, goals. Let's pick a queue system. I kind of outlined them all very, very quickly. And then get stuff running in the background. I have specs, I should mention. They're kind of silly. Nah, I wrote them after. Don't tell anybody. So our specs should run. They take 5 seconds because they take 5 seconds. but they pass. And unfortunately, they also open the page. I should really. I felt like the best part about this project was I could at least get some cheap laughs off the cat gifs, if nothing else. Okay, so the spec file. If you guys haven't seen this, the idea is to write some code that actually verifies that your application is doing what you want it to be doing. So the way to read this is I'm specifying that. Don't worry about this setup. This is, again, just kind of making sure that there are some cats in the database for me to pull. But I'm going to write a spec that says, before all this, create a user and log them in. Click on the cat me button, and then verify that our user has a cat request. Like, grab the last one and just make sure it's there. So that, at the end of the day, is what it's doing. And so those specs should verify that that's working. So once we get this working in the background, I want to make sure the specs still pass, that everything's working fine there. And we can kind of see however far we get from there. Okay, so first things first, we need to pick a queuing system. This is where I would have some discussion if we had like a small group, but if you guys don't mind too much, I'm just going to pick Sidekick. Anybody object to that? Ultimately, Sidekick takes a little more setup. If you're doing something lightweight, like I mentioned, Sucker Punch, Delayed Job, good things to look at. And again, all this is online, so don't feel like you have to remember those names. Okay, so first things first, let's look at some documentation. So the documentation is good. It tells you how to get them set up. I'm going to add the Sidekick gem to my gem file. Typing with people watching is terrifying. I'm going to install the gem. Good to go. And then what we need to do here is create a worker that's going to perform our work. So what I want to do, I'll kind of do this backwards. In my controller, so again, this is the thing that I have asked for a cat, and this is actually going to do the work. Rather than do that here, I'm going to say, let's make a cat request worker, and let's asynchronously perform. That's the Sidekick syntax there. Perform async. Oh, actually, that's a terrible idea. I apologize. What I really want to do is I want to create the cat request, right? That's our object that says I want a cat. And rather than doing the fulfillment that takes the 5 seconds of the waiting, I want to pass off that request to the worker and say, like, you have a request. Now you go do the fulfillment part of it. So that doesn't need to happen here. That needs to happen once I have a request. So let's look at the cat request. User. So the user cat me method, this is the user has asked for a cat. We create the request, and then we fulfill it. Not going to do that. Going to do cat request worker perform async request.id.
Absolutely. Why would you ever not run it asynchronously? Isn't that kind of the whole thing of background workers?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for this, especially knowing that it's a relatively long-running thing, I would always perform.
So is there a perform sync? And
yeah.
What would the value of that be?
I guess if you have a job, one of the other use cases that I have used this for is like a user uploads, like you have an admin, they're uploading CSV with a list of users that they want to bulk create, something like that. It is conceivable that if it's just like 10 users or something, you just want to go ahead and do it now. Whereas you certainly, like there's a point at which this is too much work, I'm going to have a timeout if I try and do this all now, let's push it off to the back end. But it's conceivable that you might want to have some logic that says, if this is really light work, then maybe even just handing it off to the back end is more than I want to do. Yeah. I mean, I think more often than not, if you have something that's potentially long running, just put it in a background queue all the time. If you have the logic in place to handle running it in the background, it probably doesn't hurt much. But it's conceivable that you could want to do it synchronously sometimes. Well, and I guess one of the things that, time permitting, we'll see is when you're testing, you don't really want that out-of-phase thing. So performing synchronously during testing can be valuable. Okay, so that looks good, but I don't actually have a cat request worker, so I need to make one of those. So let me make a folder for that. Yeah.
You know why you have to pass the ID to the whole object?
That is an excellent point. Okay, so as I mentioned very, very briefly, the way that Sidekick coordinates work between your web server and the background worker is it's going to pass stuff through Redis.
What is Redis?
Redis is a really simple. I mean, you can think of it like a database. It's in memory, not on disk, which means it can be really fast. So if you have like a high throughput sort of thing, it's a good solution there. Lots of other neat things about Redis that are not really relevant here. It's an awesome thing. Just go look at it. But think of it like it's a simple key value store. So you're essentially passing like a JSON blob back to your worker. You can try and serialize your model, but then you get weird situations where so you've created the cat request, you pass it off to the background worker. You may be really backed up in the queue, and the worker may not get to it for 2 days. And at some point in the interim, the user may have said, "Well, forget about this, I don't care anymore," and deleted the cat request. So if you are trying to pass through your whole request object, then the worker is going to get it and send it, even though the user doesn't want it anymore. By passing through the ID and then in the worker looking up the model, we make sure that the state of the database is current whenever we get around to doing the work. In this case, it'll be right away, so it's not a huge deal, and I don't have any reason for deleting things, but it is always really good practice to pass as simple of objects as you can, which more often than not means just a database ID, and then look it up on the other side. So yeah, excellent question. So let me actually make that worker. Cat request worker. Oh, no, sorry. Just for the Rails autoloader thing, it'll know to look there based on the name that I plan on giving it. If you do the appropriate requires, it doesn't much matter. But I'm going to call this cat request worker. So your workers, all they have to do, in the case of Sidekick at least, is include Sidekick worker job, I don't remember, worker. And then define a perform method. And the perform method will receive whatever parameters you pass to perform async. So Sidekick is really doing the work of taking the perform async call, passing it through Redis, creating a worker on the other end, and then calling it directly. So this will get a request ID. So the work, it seems like, should be, well, let's go grab that request. And then let's fulfill it there. So sorry, let's call that the request. And then call fulfill. And that ought to be it. Pretty easy, I think. So like I mentioned, though, all of the work is happening in another process. And this is sort of a common thing. Whatever modulo sucker punch, whatever solution you have, you're going to want to run. So this window is running the Rails server. I'm going to want to boot up a process to handle the actual work. So I'll do that here. With Sidekick, that's bundle exec Sidekick. And that won't actually boot up. That will boot up. OK, cool. Didn't mention this anywhere. You will have to have Redis installed because it uses Redis, but it'll complain at you about not being able to connect to Redis if it can't connect to Redis. So fingers crossed, live coding might work. Let's restart the server just to be safe. One thing I should mention, if you are used to Rails and rely on the automatic reloading of the Rails server, Sidekick will not do that. So if you make changes that you need to see in your worker, you'll have to restart it. That's because reloading is not thread safe. Sidekick uses threads, and so can't rely on anything that's not thread safe. That's one of the trade-offs there. So let's try it. We got a request. So page back. I can spam the button. Cool. And when they get done, ton of cat gifs. So yeah. Good. Good, good, good. OK. So that is pretty much all it takes. So step one, any questions there? Yes.
Can you go into what happens? What if my job fails? What do I do?
Yeah, I intend to. but I intend to wire up an admin system first so it's a little bit easier to see. I think that's probably the better place to start. Again, another quick poll. How many people are familiar with RSpec and would find value in me doing stuff with RSpec? Not half, yeah. All right. I'm going to do the admin stuff first because I think that's a little easier to actually see some tangible benefit there if you're not familiar with it. So we did some work. Let's commit it. Oh, sorry. Come on. So cool, committed, done. Good job, guys. All right, so like I mentioned, many of these solutions ship with built-in admin systems. Sidekick does, Resque doesn't, but there's a gem. For the case of Sidekick, I hope I remember this. So Sidekick's monitoring system is a Sinatra app, if you know what that is. If not, again, not a big deal. So we'll need to make sure we have Sinatra. In the routes, we just want to require, anybody happen to know this off the top of their head? Web, maybe? We'll try it. And then mount. So that'll import Sidekick web, maybe? That may fail catastrophically, but we'll try it. So all that's doing is pulling in the built-in Sidekick Sinatra app and mounting it as a route under your Rails app. So if all went well, you should be able to see it. So cool, but super responsive and not useful. Okay, so here's your dashboard. As it says, we have processed 4 background jobs. They all worked. You get some metrics. Obviously, we haven't been doing this very long, so the metrics aren't very interesting. But if you notice, it has some provisions for tracking jobs that have failed, jobs that are busy in process. You can look at what queues you have running. I won't touch on kind of configuring multiple queues, but you can get into performance tuning there. Busy, the stuff that's actually in process. So that's Sidekick admin. Super easy to install. One of the nice things about Sidekick. Now let's look at what might happen if your job fails. So the fulfill method, again, we're sort of pretending that this is hitting an external service. Oh yeah, sorry, question.
Can you please give an example of different jobs that might be running at the same time? For people that don't know too much about it.
Oh sure, well, whatever jobs you have in your system, they all can run more or less simultaneously. We have some systems where I work where we may have multiple clients all computing things like heavy computations that run in the background. At the same time, it may be sending emails in the background as those are relevant. Could be for new users signing up or just like users that have signed up to have dashboards mailed to them once a week. Cleaning up old entries, that like all of that can happen at the same time. The nice thing is no one is waiting around for this work to happen. So whatever you need to do, it can all be going on in the background. So I mean that the background work doesn't have to be from people accessing it. It can be triggered by whatever. A user has gone onto the system at some point in time and said, I want these metrics mailed to me every morning at 8. Then your background worker will just sit there and every morning at 8, it'll send out some emails. And maybe at 8 o'clock, someone happens to be requesting a particularly large cat GIF. That's cool. They can all work at the same time. Does that address your question? Okay. All right, any other questions? All right, so let's look a little bit at what can happen if a job fails. So pretend that this is hitting some external service, and in this case, the service is just down. So it's just going to raise an error and not get anywhere. Remember, I've made a change to my worker, so I'm going to have to restart this. That's sort of a common thing. So let's try and look at some cats now. So notice the page is still super fast. I can still make a whole bunch of responses. I'm getting the response, or make a lot of requests. I'm getting the response back quickly. But as I sit here and wait, I'm not seeing any cats, and that's making me sad. We can check the This is the log for the background worker, and you see all of the really verbose error messages saying what's happening. But at the end of the day, it's just hitting that nope error and not getting anywhere. So this is one of the downsides, well, depending on your perspective. If you have a job that's going to fail, it's nice that it can happen in the background and you can address like retrying it. But you do have to think about the possibility that background jobs can fail, and you have to have some provision in place for handling that. Sidekick has some notion of that out of the box. So if you notice, so there's the jobs that happened. A whole bunch of them failed. It's retrying a whole bunch. So let's take a look at that. I believe this does a thing where like it'll retry after, specifics could be wrong here, but it'll retry a job like 5 seconds after it fails. And then if that fails, we'll retry it 10 seconds later and then 20 seconds later and kind of ease off that way. Maybe no specifics.
Just like an exponential back off, which ends up going over the course of about 20 or 21 days, at which point it goes to the dead queue for like 6 months.
So it'll sit there and keep retrying, and if the service you're trying to hit gets up anywhere in those 21 days, you have a decent odds of actually getting the work through.
It's a total of about 20 or 21 retries at the end of it.
So in our case, nothing's ever going to get through because it's just going to hit that error every time. But you might see this being useful, if the failure isn't every time and is instead kind of intermittent. So So this is grabbing a random number, and if it's less than 0.8, it fails, but may succeed sometimes. So I'll restart the worker. And let me just retry all these jobs. Didn't retry them. So some of them hit that probably not error. Retry them again. Again, it'll automatically retry after a while, but I don't want to sit here and wait on that. So some of them, again, errored for random reasons, but this one got through, still waited its 5 seconds, because it still waits 5 seconds, it's still a long-running thing, but eventually managed to show the cat. So you can imagine, if, sorry, it's cute. So if the system you're trying to communicate with is intermittently down, it'll keep retrying, and eventually the work will get through, and whatever you're trying to accomplish will happen. So another thing worth mentioning here, when you are thinking about jobs that could fail, Sidekick actually has some kind of loose guarantees. It will retry things until they succeed, but there are some kind of edge cases where it may end up trying a job more than once. So, if you're being robust about this, you also want to handle that possibility. So I think if I were writing this for a real production thing and not cat GIFs, you want to think about what could really go wrong here, and I can think of two things. One is, like we mentioned, there's the possibility that maybe that cat request got deleted between, the time it got registered and the time we're actually trying to fulfill it. So in that case, that lookup will fail, and then the job will keep failing, and it'll keep trying to look up something that's not there over and over and over again. You don't really want to do that. So you could tweak this to be something like, is there a non-erroring version of find?
You can do find by ID.
Yeah, I normally do where. So find where first. That'll just be nil if there isn't one there. So in that case, you can return unless you actually have a request. That's one approach to it. Anybody think of other things that might go wrong here? Depending on your application, this may or may not be a problem, but there is a possibility that somewhere between the time that this got generated and the time you're actually handling it, the request was fulfilled by something else. Maybe another job has already run it, or there's some other mechanism in your system for fulfilling these requests. And you really, they're cat GIFs, so everybody likes those, and they wouldn't be too mad about it. But if it's an email, you don't want your job running over and over and spamming a user with the same, copies of the same email. So what I would do is something like, and this is probably, again, totally dependent on your application, but I really never want a request to be fulfilled more than once. So I would say here, just return if cat.present. Right, so fulfilling that attaches a cat to the request. If I already have a cat attached, then it's been fulfilled, and I don't want to do it again. So I'll just skip out early there. That's really good practice when you're working with background jobs. You really want to think kind of defensively, and anytime you're building kind of larger distributed systems, you want to think defensively about, all right, what could fail, and does my app respond appropriately when things fail? Yeah.
I know you mentioned Sidekick uses Redis.
Yes.
So one of the tricks I used to lay job. Redis is awesome. But I'm not as familiar with it. One of the tricks I do a lot with my delayed jobs is use the fact that they're creating SQL insert statements. So I often surround them by transactions. So everything gets queued, or nothing gets queued at all. And then we know, wait, I gotta investigate because. And I wonder if there's the concept like that, and where it seems to be really useful is like the mailing list example, where you're sending out, 1,000 emails to people that need to know that something changed about their accounts or something. But if some odd data attribute that messed through tests on like user number 900 of 1,000 causes the whole process to crash.
Right.
And now you don't know who got their email and who didn't.
So
like that whole transactional integrity and using it.
yeah, that's a nice approach. I guess if you were thinking about something like that, maybe Raj can actually speak to this. Sidekick has a premium version, Sidekick Pro, that has a lot of kind of more advanced features like that. I know it's got some atomicity guarantees from Redis, and it has a concept of batching jobs together. So you treat them like one, but then they run one at a time, and you can retry individual ones that fail. Something. I haven't used it myself, so.
RPL publish from Redis, which is you can actually implement it yourself if you want. It just does it nicely for you. And basically, it gives you that level of guarantee where Redis time, persistence disk, and all those other things you need to do. It also does batches and notifications. So if you want to parallelize your jobs, you can do that too. I'm sure you'll get into that. So it is nice.
Yeah, they have that caveat in their docs that if MRI or Sidekick causes a SIG fault while it's doing your stuff, then it's not going to get requeued unless it's Sidekick Pro. So don't SIG fault MRI.
That's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Just in general. I'm going to tweak that down to sleep too, because you guys get the idea. What other changes? So cool. We have. Oh, and I will. Oh, that's fine. So it's not failing. All right. So we have done some more work. We've added. So I'll commit that. Let's take a look at our goals and see where we are. So we've got a queue backend. We're fulfilling in the background. My tests almost certainly do not pass. So let's get into that, unless anyone has questions. Okay. So let's take a look at it. We'll run the tests. Failure. What's going on here? So I know what's going on here, but I'll kind of explore the process as I would if I were encountering something that I wasn't familiar with. How many folks here are familiar with Pry? Pry is awesome. I love Pry. Any sort of debugging tool, but I particularly like Pry. It is such a great tool for exploring code that you're not super familiar with. So let me kind of illustrate some of that. So let's take a look at this first off. The catme spec is failing. It expects that request.cat to be present, and it isn't. So I guess we could start there. But let's think about that. Where does the cat actually get set? Well, that's happening on the cat request fulfill. So I'd like to kind of step through this and see where things are going wrong. So what you can do is just drop a binding.pry wherever you want to explore, and then run the spec. And when it gets to that point, it should stop. When it gets to that point, it should stop and let you explore the state.
Hey,
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that was dropping a binding down from your model, not a Sidekick job.
More.
Could you maybe give some pointers to why not?
That's a reasonable approach. I mean, different people approach these problems differently. But my logic here would be, okay, our spec says that the request.cat should be set. It's not being set. What should set it? This. All right, well, let's check that out. You could approach it differently and say, all right, I know the flow through the application should be, I make a request, it goes to the background job does some stuff, yada, yada, yada. So you may want to stop it at the background job point and kind of see where things are. Totally reasonable. This is what I would do first. But notice something a little odd here. We're not getting to that. Anybody know why? I'm sure Raj knows why. Guesses? No, the random number's out. I took that out. Yeah, I'm looking at fulfill. So, I mean, the thing is, I should be stopping as soon as something calls fulfill. So I guess nothing is calling fulfill. And this is where I would back up and think, all right, so what calls fulfill? Well, that's the worker. Exactly. So here's the problem with testing and background workers. That work is happening in a separate process. And I haven't really coordinated that. So like we mentioned, one of the retries finally worked. Good.
There come the other 10.
Good. That could get confusing. I'm going to delete these.
Example of it trying later and working.
But yeah, that just illustrates how robust the system is. It's good. Okay, so the thing that's happening here is sort of, it's a pretty common problem with these background solutions. The work is happening in the background. The whole point of this was we're not going to stop what we're doing to actually fulfill this request. So, usually what we're doing is returning a response, but in the case of specs, what we're doing is testing this response. So we click on the cat button, we get a request back immediately, and the spec says, all right, do I have a cat yet? Well, no, we don't. That's the whole point. We're not going to get a cat for another 5 seconds. So what we need to do is tell the specs, all right, I actually do want to stop and wait for this. And I don't want to hack up my application logic. I mean, it's working correctly. So it turns out this is a really normal problem. Sidekick has some tools for handling this. And what you can do is just add, if you're not super familiar with testing, if you add a file in spec/support with standard RSpec configs, it'll run that. So I like to do little additions there.
James, what are your thoughts on just testing that the method gets sent to Sidekick and then saying, okay, the message is passed?
It would be a little hard to instrument a spec at that point. Like you'd have to have something that intercepts the message coming from Sidekick, and that's sort of a Sidekick internal thing. So it would be a little hard to break there. If this were, again, a bigger app, might do is spec the worker and spec that when I call perform with an ID, it does what I expect. And that's where, again, having a non-async version of the perform method is useful. But yeah, I think trying to spec, I did this controller thing and got a message into Sidekick is a little too much testing Sidekick internals. So I usually don't worry about that. But Sidekick has a tool for this. Most systems will. I think it's Sidekick inline. No, testing. Testing, and then Sidekick inline. Anybody know this one by chance? Does that look right? Or, yeah, we'll try it. Oh. Have jobs running? Oh. Sorry, I'm confusing the issue. Recall before I did that, I did a spec that had a pry inside the worker. That one finally got through. What was happening there? Don't worry too much about that one. Apparently that wasn't right. What languages include?
Most of them.
It's not PHP. I mean, it is PHP, but I'm not thinking PHP.
Most of them.
All right, I'm sorry. I thought I knew this. I'm consulting the docs. You guys are getting to see development, warts and all.
You did the right thing. I just looked it up. Sidekick/testing and then inline.
Sidekick, : testing.
Testing.
That's the problem.
Sorry, I thought you had it in there.
Nah, I didn't. So seriously, Google is your friend. I Google constantly. No shame in it. Okay, and so now we see, not in the worker process, but in fact in our actual spec process, we're hitting the binding.pry coming from the fulfill, coming inside the worker. So this is.
C is also.
Say what?
C is also.
Oh, yeah, that's probably it.
Counting.
Yeah. So at this point, I mean, the problem was just that, but I do want to point out some stuff about pry that's really awesome. You get just a full-on console, so you can check like self, which is the thing that I'm currently prying around. So I'm inside a cat request. And notice I haven't fulfilled it yet. Specifically, the cat ID associated with it isn't nil. I don't have a cat yet. It's got some other timestamp stuff. Really good investigative tool because you can do things like ls and list the methods that are available to you. It's kind of crazy how many methods Active Record builds in, but these are all of them and where they come from if you care. The interesting ones tend to be at the bottom. So cat request has some methods that you can see. So this is a really good way of, if you don't know where code is, like what code is actually doing, like drop a pry at the point where you don't understand and then just start poking around. It's a really good way to, I mean, find a bug, but just understand your system better. So you can see the fulfill method. I often like to step through the commands kind of one at a time to see where things go wrong. Actually, there's a way to do that.
That requires either pry.pybug if you're on
Yeah.
MRI.
So,
If you're pre that,
okay. I don't have any of that in here. You can add in some tooling that'll just say, all right, cool, so I'm here, things are like I expect here, let's step onto the next command and see how they look, let's step onto the next command and see how they look, and you kind of work through things that way. If you don't have those tools installed, you can always just kind of mock it manually. So I can, what would happen if I called this command now? Well, so I guess I should pick a cat. So let's update it with choosing a random cat. I could even break it out and say, what's a random cat? Here are some random cats. And I have updated the attributes to include that. So self, I now have a cat attached to this request. And I could open the download path for that cat. And that'll work like it actually does when it runs. So, sorry, you guys can't see that. Good. So yeah, I definitely recommend kind of exploring your system that way. And lo and behold, once we get everything wired up appropriately, the specs pass, so we can. The inline method is the thing that says, don't actually run any of these perform calls in the background process thread queue. It just, when I call perform async, just pass that on to perform and do it right here, right now. So I don't have to worry about all those weird synchronization things. I really can just test inline. Oh. Okay. So, yeah. Cool. So we have passing tests. That's round about the hour mark. Again, there's a lot of detail I could get into here, but we've covered a lot, especially if people aren't super familiar with Rails. That's a whole lot to absorb. Let me, again, recommend. This is, I'm hoping, if you don't get every single detail here, totally fine. What I really aim to do here is kind of get you guys a sense of what, working through like day-to-day applications that aren't super glamorous or some shiny new technology, like what that actually kind of looks like a little bit. Like I said, I'd like to get this a little more hands-on and smaller groups and interactive at some point. But if you're new here, hopefully you got kind of a general sense of the sorts of things that you think about and maybe the ways you approach problems when you're doing this day to day. So that said, I'll break here for questions. I'd be glad to hang out and talk to people, get into any more specifics people want to hear.
We have plenty more beer, so feel free to have some more. And then after this, after we talk for a minute or two, if you still want to hang out, we're all thinking good in the industry. It's a bar within walking distance. And Cycle can get the first round of drinks, and I'm sure that's Cycle and it's going to get the first round of drinks if you guys want to hang around with that.
And like I mentioned, I would love to continue doing these. I don't know what would be useful for you guys, so talk to me. And seriously, like if you're interested in leading a small group, do it. Like make something happen. Yeah. Any of that, I would be happy to make this whatever you guys want.
You can break out into groups in which, if you want to talk about specific subjects, I can be folks there and then another.
Sure.
So whatever you got.
So feedback, like let me know what would be helpful.
Do a quick round of applause for James.
No. Thank you. So yeah, any questions?
What do you do to throttle background tasks?
Throttle to what end?
So to avoid a DDoS on say million user requests every email. You want to only send a couple of hundred.
Sure. I think the thing with email that I'm usually more concerned about. So at one point, I think GitHub even did this to us. We had like 200 issues. Somebody bulk closed a whole board, and then we got 200 emails from GitHub. So what can make sense in those situations is not so much thinking about throttling as thinking about batching. So rather than your job being, all right, somebody does something that's going to trigger an email. Here's an email whenever I get it ready. Your job is maybe no longer. And this is one thing I kind of didn't mention. Everything I talked about here was the user takes an action, and then we'll eventually do some stuff on their behalf. It doesn't have to be that. I mean, you're doing this work in the background. Anything can trigger it. It can be a cron task. It can be a clock. There's in the blog post I mentioned lots of options there. So in a situation like that, what I would do is just accumulate them in the queue. And unless you're pushing the point where you're storing more things in Redis than fit in main memory, which would take a long time to happen, then
How would you do that? What did you use?
I haven't had that problem.
How would you do what?
So you have all these background jobs.
Yeah.
So let's say somebody gets swamped and you want to either batch it or throttling.
Well, at least in the case of Sidekick, for example, you specify a degree of concurrency.
Okay.
So you stand up either, say you provision like a dozen VMs. Like you have tons of background jobs. You got like 1 million people hit your site a day or something. You provision a dozen VMs. Each one of them might spawn like 8 threads that process Sidekick jobs. And so they'll just go as fast as they can go. Each one of those 8 threads on each one of the 12 VMs will grab a job off the queue, do the work, say I'm done, and then get the next one. So they'll only go as fast as they can go.
You can tell Sidekick how many.
Yeah, you tell it how concurrent to be. So, if you put it on a tiny little T1 micro, then, do 4, do 10, it depends. And, maybe it's really light stuff, and it's just, maybe most of the work your Sidekick workers do is just wait on the network stack to return an answer from, Mandrill or something saying I sent your email.
And that's
Or you might load up a ton of data from S3 and then run intensive data processing, in which case maybe you only want like 1 or 2 workers on that box. And maybe it's a bigger box too.
And if you're doing tremendous outbound email volume, like not even so much, you want to actually not necessarily even have to work with threads, contact Mandrill directly, you probably want to use something like Postfix email server on a Linux image inside your same data center with all your worker nodes to take all those and then relay that out through Mandrill. So you set up as a satellite system, so you end up using Postfix as an SMTP accelerator. So because it can pop onto the queue, and now it's a mail server. It knows how to send SMTP.
But at the end of the day, the background job things usually have a way to specify how much concurrency you want. So it's not just like full bore, oh my god, you're drowning. Like, if you were on Heroku, you would specify in your proc file that, worker is, bundle exec Sidekick, and then you'd allocate like 3 worker nodes in that class, and then you'd spit up 3 worker nodes and run Sidekick, or run with your fig file in your command, and each one of those would have like 10 processors or something.
Yeah, all of the queuing systems have a whole lot of performance tuning options about, like setting up certain queues and giving certain queues priorities over others and specifying how many workers draw from how many queues. That's a little outside of the scope here, but there are lots of options for sure. If you have a problem that you can't fix by scaling up more workers and it's still overflowing the backlog of Redis, I would like to talk to you afterwards because that sounds interesting.
Yeah. Maybe you should install New Relic and configure it to monitor your workers and figure out what the heck is going on.
Delete all the sleep statements. They're garbage. Yeah, question.
Yeah, on a similar note, there's also a gem for a delayed job. It's called Workflex that will let you automatically scale on Heroku. I think anywhere but Heroku is really good because you can scale it down to 0. And then,
Oh, like in response to how much workload?
So Heroku is turn your workers up and down.
It'll turn on a worker and you pay for that. So you can run really cheaply.
When I looked at those sorts of things, the monitoring piece of it still, you had to pay for that, and I'm just too cheap for a lot of my apps. So Sucker Punch is cool for those. But yeah, no, there are options to respond to incoming traffic that way.
Sucker Punch is also good for things outside of purely delaying jobs, but for doing actor model concurrency when you're...
Yeah. I should just throw this out there. Sucker Punch and Resque, they're multi-threaded. They're both built on Celluloid, which is a really interesting framework for doing...
You got Celluloid in your stack there when you crashed.
Yeah. What?
I said Sidekick's on Celluloid too, I believe.
Yeah. Didn't I say that?
You just said Rescue was a delayed job.
Oh, sorry. I meant Sidekick, not Resque. Resque is not multi-threaded. Sidekick and Sucker Punch run on Celluloid. Sorry if I said that all wrong. And if you're interested in kind of multi-threading processing in Ruby, Celluloid is a really interesting way of approaching it using the actor pattern, if you know what that is. So worth looking at, kind of cool in its own right. Yeah. Multi-threading is an interesting world. Any other questions? All right, cool. Well, thanks for coming, guys. Seriously, it's encouraging to see so many people here. Again, we'll try and figure out what this group should be and maybe do some smaller group breakout sorts of things. But thank y'all. And again, I'll be here.
We hope you've enjoyed this video presentation of a talk given at a monthly Atlanta Ruby Users Group meeting. This video has been sponsored by Rieta Incorporated. As an Atlanta-based Rails consultancy, Rieta transforms high-level business problems into technical solutions. For more videos like this one, please see the ATLRUG videos playlist.